To me, the study of history is three things: history, psychology, and philosophy. Those three things might not seem to go together at first, but let me explain what I mean here. The philosophy aspect of it is the what and the how of history. What's in the world around us? How do we know? What's the meaning of life? Why do we care about any of this, and what should be done about it? Because without that should aspect of it, what should we do with this information and what should we do with the world around us, there's really no point to studying history. Otherwise, the study of history would just become a string of useless facts and events and dates, which would be of no use to anybody as far as bettering themselves. Psychology is the second aspect I mentioned, and this is the why of history. So why do humans and other creatures do the things that they do? I think any serious discussion of history is centered on why the events that happened unfolded the way they did, and why the humans in the stories behaved the way that they did. And to understand that, you really need to understand human psychology to help you answer those questions. The third element of it, besides philosophy and psychology, is just the history of it. So history is nothing more than the history of all these things accumulating, and it's almost like a big experiment that goes on over the course of thousands of years where we can learn together what works and what doesn't work. So history, psychology, and philosophy, all important in my view. But sadly, I think that as a society, we are in danger of losing touch with all of these things. In popular culture, and more importantly, in the education system, I think there's more of a shift towards the goal being all about practicality and career readiness. Kids at a very young age are essentially taught that unless what they're learning has a direct and obvious link to their chosen career path, then it's not important. As a result, I think you're seeing a general shift away from classes in education like history and psychology and philosophy, because these classes about the meaning of life and why we should care about the people around us and why humans behave the way they do and the importance of the people that came before us in shaping our current age and our future age, these classes and these questions are not seen as practical or preparing students for careers from the perspective of the powers that be. Let me give you an example of this. As I was doing research for this episode, this was an article I'd read before that popped into my mind. It's an article by Valerie Strauss in the Washington Post titled, "A University of Wisconsin Campus Pushes Plan to Drop 13 Majors, Including English, History, and Philosophy." And the gist of the article is that due to a variety of political and financial reasons, classes in the kind of humanities segment of the university, like we talked about, psychology, history, philosophy, sociology, these classes are getting the axe in favor of things that have more clear benefits as far as getting you into a career quickly and easily after college or high school or whatever. So here's what Strauss says in the article, quote, "The University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point has proposed dropping 13 majors in the humanities and social sciences, including English, philosophy, history, sociology, and Spanish, while adding programs with, quote, clear career pathways, end quote, as a way to address declining enrollment and a multi-million-dollar deficit, end quote." The author goes on to say that these types of cuts are in line with some changes that had been proposed in Wisconsin a couple of years before, trying to change the way universities worked. Here's how she describes those proposed changes that came from the state government ordering the university system to make changes, quote, by removing words that commanded the university to, quote, search for truth and improve the human condition, and replacing them with, quote, meet the state's workforce needs, end quote. I think this particular situation is a very specific example that has a lot of factors going into play, but I also think this is a general trend happening across education and happening across the way that we think about what's important from a learning perspective. Obviously, I'm all for practicality and making things relevant in a direct way for young kids, but I also worry about the dangers of losing history education and the humanities and philosophy and psychology and this style of education in general. Because if that gets cut out or diminished in a big way, then you lose out on the journey to find some of the big answers to the big questions in life. And this search for those answers can be fulfilling in and of itself. And I think it can give you the practicality that you're looking for if you follow that path the right way. So I do think that a recalibration of the trend we're heading down in the realm of education, where history and philosophy and the humanities are seen with kind of condescension and derision, I think a recalibration of making these classes more respected could be a good thing. And this brings us to the Tao of Pooh. Written in 1982 by a guy by the name of Benjamin Hoff, the point of the book is to give an overview of the philosophy of Taoism to anyone that wants to get an overview, whether it be kids or adults. The point of the book is that it's accessible and it's not really a comprehensive or pretentious overview, but it will give you a general sense of the philosophy of Taoism and certainly avenues to look into delving into it more. And regardless of your belief system or philosophy or religious belief or whatever, these types of questions and ideas that Hoff brings up in the book certainly should not be ignored in the world of education. Again, to me, there's nothing more important that we can be teaching young people than how to think and how to be open-minded and how to spot logical fallacies and all these things that philosophy and reading into philosophy gets us. The younger, the better, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to learning about this stuff. Again, what could be more practical than equipping young people with a sense of purpose and a curiosity about the world around them and an understanding of some of the big questions in life. And in this particular book, Benjamin Hoff attempts to do that by giving an overview of Taoism as seen through the lens of the children's story Winnie the Pooh. The book is about 150 pages. There's plenty of illustrations in the book. It's not a particularly long read, but there is a lot of wisdom held in the pages. I don't believe that you can get the book online. When you hold, at least the version I have, it does have a little bit of an old school feel to it. And as I was reading it, I was wondering if the fact that it's not available in digital format is kind of a symbol for a lot of the stuff that is explained in the book, at least as far as technology solving a lot of our problems as a species, but perhaps also causing more problems than we anticipated. But anyway, if you can get your hands on the book, I definitely recommend giving it a read. Here's the author, Benjamin Hoff, describing his idea to write this book. Quote, I began to get an idea to write a book that explained the principles of Taoism through Winnie the Pooh, and explained Winnie the Pooh through the principles of Taoism. When informed of my intentions, the scholars exclaimed, preposterous, and things like that. Others said it was the stupidest thing they ever heard, and that I must be dreaming. Some said it was a nice idea, but too difficult. Just where would you even begin, they asked. Well, an old Taoist saying puts it this way. 1,000-mile journey starts with one step. End quote. Benjamin Hoff opens the book with the narrator explaining the famous story of the vinegar tasters that represent the Eastern religions. The exact details of the story vary, but here's a version of it. 3 men are standing around a jar of vinegar. Each man dips his finger in and tastes it. One man has a sour taste, the other one proclaims that it is bitter, and the last one is smiling and proclaims that the vinegar is pleasant. The vinegar in the story represents life and the totality of the experiences that you're going to have. All the world around you and all that it entails, and maybe even how best to make sense of it. And the tasters represent the 3 famous Eastern religions or philosophies, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Confucius thought that the vinegar was sour. So there's this kind of general idea that the vinegar representing life, and life is kind of out of order. It could be better than it is. So for Confucius, life was about relationships and rituals and ceremony. Things in the present have gone haywire, so a reverence and respect for ancestors and ways of life in the past is important. Things and life are out of order, and they must be put in their proper place in order to achieve harmony. A pretty well-known concept from Confucianism is something called filial piety, the concept of respect for ancestors, respect for parents and the elderly, treating them well, learning from them, and respecting that relationship. The second guy to taste the vinegar was the Buddha. And the Buddha, of course, the founder of Buddhism, felt that the vinegar was bitter. Here's what Benjamin Hoff has to say about the Buddha in this story of the vinegar tasters. Quote, to Buddha, life on earth was bitter, filled with attachments and desires that led to suffering. The world was seen as a setter of traps, a generator of illusions, a revolving wheel of pain for all creatures. In order to find peace, the Buddhists considered it necessary to transcend the world of dust and reach nirvana, literally a state of no wind. Although the essentially optimistic attitude of the Chinese altered Buddhism considerably after it was brought in from its native India, the devout Buddhists often saw the way to nirvana interrupted all the same by the bitter wind of everyday existence. End quote. So for the Buddha, the goal is to transcend the world of suffering and desire and achieve enlightenment. Only by removing yourself from bitter sufferings and the worldly desires and the temporary material possessions can you do that. Through meditation and other techniques, you realize that you can, as Hoff says, quote, remove the interruptions, end quote, and the everyday experiences and sufferings and desires that prevent us from reaching nirvana. Connected to this idea is an idea that's difficult to grasp, and I'm not sure I fully understand it, but the supposed realization that there is no self. So there's no person inside your head kind of seeing things and thinking things and worrying about things. Transcending that might be something that is seen as important. And again, this is just a simplistic overview of some things that I see as important from my understanding of Confucianism and Buddhism. By no means is this a deep dive into the philosophies under any circumstance. But the reason I do it is because I think that vinegar story and an understanding of those 2 religions in particular, gives you a much better understanding of Taoism and its founder, who was Lao Tzu. Probably coming a few years after Confucius in the 500 BCE, but maybe not. Not much is known about Lao Tzu, but most scholars tend to think he was either a contemporary of Confucius or someone that looked at the teachings of Confucius years after and responding to them. So according to Hoff, the key thing for Lao Tzu was that the natural laws of the universe are the same everywhere. So it's not about putting things in their place like it is with Confucianism, putting everything in the right place, in the right order, with the right relationship. And it's also not about removing yourself or avoiding sufferings and desires and the material world, like some might say Buddhism is. For Lao Tzu and Taoism, it's more about learning and finding out the way of the universe and then joining in with it. Here's Benjamin Hoff early in the Tao of Pooh describing Lao Tzu. Quote, according to Lao Tzu, the more man interfered with the natural balance produced and governed by the universal laws, the further away the harmony retreated into the distance. The more forcing, the more trouble. Whether heavy or light, wet or dry, fast or slow, everything had its own nature already within it, which could not be violated without causing difficulties. When abstract and arbitrary rules were imposed from the outside, struggle was inevitable. Only then did life become sour. To Lao Tzu, the world was not a setter of traps, but a teacher of valuable lessons. Its lessons needed to be learned, just as its laws needed to be followed. Then all would go well. Rather than turn away from the world of dust, Lao Tzu advised others to join the dust of the world. What he saw operating behind everything in heaven and earth he called Tao, the way. A basic principle of Lao Tzu's teaching was that this way of the universe could not be adequately described in words, and that it would be insulting both to its unlimited power and to the intelligent human mind to attempt to do so. Still, its nature could be understood, and those who cared the most about it, and the life from which it was inseparable, understood it best. End quote. So according to Hoff, Taoism is about being in harmony with both the external nature of the world and your own internal nature. And going back to the vinegar tasters, Hoff asks, why was Lao Tzu smiling? And he says, quote, after all, that vinegar that represents life must certainly have an unpleasant taste, as the expressions on the faces of the other two men indicate. But through working in harmony with life's circumstances, Taoist understanding changes what others may perceive as negative into something positive. From the Taoist point of view, sourness and bitterness come from the interfering and unappreciative mind. Life itself, when understood and utilized for what it is sweet. That is the message of the vinegar tasters. End quote. Throughout the book, The Tao of Pooh, Benjamin Hoff goes through many of what he sees as the key concepts of Taoism. Stuff like we've already talked about, like harmony with nature and respecting your own inner nature, trying to avoid interference that isn't necessary, concepts like yin and yang and action through inaction, and the general benefits of simplicity as opposed to making things unnecessarily complicated. And Hoff uses the stories from Winnie the Pooh to illustrate these concepts very simply and effectively, not just for adults that might be reading, but also in a way that people of all ages could get something out of it. Even if you don't agree with some of what Benjamin Hoff is saying in the book, or if you don't agree with any of the philosophies of Taoism or any of the other philosophies or religions, or, pick your poison there. Even if that's the case, there is value in learning about this kind of stuff. And particularly at a young age, asking those questions and stimulating that thought as far as humanities topics like philosophy and sociology and psychology, and trying to find some sort of meaning in the study of history. And just to tie it back to that Washington Post article I talked about at the beginning of the episode, I fear that in many ways this type of learning is going by the wayside. I think that if you have that fear as well, or maybe if I've convinced you that that fear is rational to have, I think the Tao of Pooh would be a good place to start as far as stimulating your own questions and looking for answers that way. So in this episode, I thought it made a little bit more sense to say what I wanted to say about the state of history education and give a sort of introduction to the book and some of the general context and background to Taoism and what Benjamin Hoff is going to be talking about in the Tao of Pooh. And in the next episode, I will get a lot more into the actual contents of the book and why I think it's valuable. To me, it made sense to split that into 2 episodes, so I would expect that in a couple weeks. And as always, if you've made it this far, thanks for listening.